Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about the second part of the tunic making process. We're going to discuss how to put the sleeves and the gores on, and also how to sew the finished sides so that you end up with a tunic right up to the point where you're going to start hemming, which I don't cover in this video. So with no further ado, here we have the finished neckline inside out, and we're actually just at the process right now where we're re-ironing that center seam so that it's nice and crisp, and that will make sense in just a moment. And when you're ironing, please make sure that you spread it out nice and straight, unlike me, because I'm trying to hold a camera at the same time as doing everything else, which probably wasn't the smartest thing, but hey, this technology thing can be hard at times. So these are the little underarm gussets that you made. There are 4 of them, and that is the sleeve with the fold in the center. You are matching up the 2 corners, and you're going to be sewing along there. You'll know it's right if it looks like that. Remember to put the good side and the good side together. I can't tell you how many garments I have sewn and realized I put these things in inside out. Some fabrics it doesn't matter so much. This kind of fabric it matters a lot. So you'll see I have 2 of them on there, and you do that with both sleeves. And here you can see I have them sewn on, and we have the bad side of the inside of the fabric up. And I iron this at this point with the triangle part flat, and again that'll come clear in a couple of minutes here. And I iron a little bit along the edge there just because it makes later piecing together a little easier. So you can see how nice and flat that is. There's a nice like 3/4 of an inch seam there, maybe a bit more, maybe half an inch, it's hard to tell. And you can see how it folds over there. When you're sewing it, it'll actually flip over kind of like that. But by ironing it that way, it makes it a lot easier for the final product. And you're going to do the same thing on the other side. So here you can see I am folding the triangle part in and ironing just a little bit down there. Not too far, doesn't have to be the whole edge. Just enough to let it sit right when you go to piece things together. Now I will say for the record that I didn't actually pin any of these together. Please pin them together. Don't be a douche the way I was, because it makes it more difficult. You see how nice and straight that is? You're going to be sewing along that edge when we go to sew the pieces together, because that's kind of the underarm. But before we get to that part, you actually have to sew the sleeve onto the body. And here we have the body. Remember how I said it was important to have that crease along the neckline? That's so you know where that top of the shoulder is. By the way, do you see that little white stripe that says Joanne down there? Remember that later. I'll discuss that later. So, the halfway point of the sleeve meets up with the halfway point on the shoulder. This gives you a very easy visual for when you're pinning, and please do pin these and make sure they're sitting nice and neat, because the more pinning and piecing you do now, the easier it will be when you get to sewing. And again, this applies whether you're hand sewing or machine sewing. I'm being a little bit, it's hard for me to do this right now because I didn't have the tripod set up yet, and getting it to sit right with the phone in my hand was not as easy. But you're going to be sewing along this line all the way across, and that's the placement of the sleeve, and you'll do the same thing down the other side. And then you sit down to sew and realize your bobbin is empty, and so you refill it. Haha, This is something you will become familiar with if you use a sewing machine. Yes, I have a Singer Heavy Duty and I love it. I highly recommend them. So here is the finished sleeve attached. Oh no, see that little piece there? It's a fold. Ugh, I can't believe I did that. What the heck? But hey, it's a mistake. You guys can see my mistakes. You'll see that that fold has been sewn over neatly. When you go through the machine, you're only going to go through slowly because it's several layers of fabric. And once again, we're going to pull out the handy dandy iron and we're going to iron this sucker flat, because the more ironing you do now, the better your piece will come out in the end. And don't iron one-handed while holding a phone. Always make sure to use two hands so that everything comes out flat and you don't end up with little lines and quirky bits in it. And at this point, once the sleeves are sewn on, you don't need that center piece anymore, so it's okay if you iron over top of it. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just for placing the sleeves on so that it looks right. Now, that little quirk, the little fold that you saw in the fabric, is not actually that big a deal. Once the garment is finished, it will not be even remotely noticeable, except to the person who sewed it. I will see it forever. Every time the owner of this dons it, it will stick out like a sore thumb and cause me great distress. But that's okay. I'm the only person who will know. Well, and the however many people watch this video. Now that the sleeves are on, again, you want to put it good side of the fabric up, the outside of the fabric up, and you're going to place the gores. Those are the large triangles. There are 4 of them, and there are 2 lefts and 2 rights. And there's a reason for that. See how that's got a flat? I didn't make it an actual corner. That's because it makes it easier to sew this gore in. It goes on right at the edge of where the sleeve is. So that's the underarm gusset, which is going to lead straight into the gore. You're going to lay that out nice and neat. I ended up at the finished product putting about 1 finger space in between the gusset and the gore just to make it sit neatly, and that worked out very well. So you can see that there's a left and a right there, and you need to do that on the other side as well. Now, as you can see, now that I have it neatly laid out, it's actually a lot longer than the fabric itself, and that can be for a lot of reasons, but we're just going to cut it off slightly larger than it needs to be so that it's not flopping around while we're trying to sew. And look at that, voila, it is not only shorter, but it's also neatly pinned. Pinning is a great way to keep things from sliding around before you put them in the sewing machine. So, having sewn all 4 of my gores on and ironed them out the same way that I ironed out the gussets, you now get introduced to me using a tripod, sort of. The real tripod comes in later, but here I'm checking the size of the seams on the inner side of the fabric. If I was going to machine fell the seams, I would do it now, because it's much easier to flat fell those while it's open, and then you just have the sides to do at the end. I, however, decided that I was going to hand fell because it's something I actually enjoy sewing, and so I'm going to fold this in half, make it nice and neat and ready to rumble. It's important that you get this all nice and neat and flat, because if you are sewing along and there is a fold, you can accidentally sew over the fold, and let me tell you, that's really frustrating. You want this seam to be very nice and straight and as even as possible, and when you're sewing, start at the sleeve and work your way to that underarm gusset and then down. And if you're going to fudge anything, if it doesn't quite match up, fudge it under the arm. Nobody will see it. except you. You'll always see your errors. They will always stick out. I was a bad girl and didn't actually pin any of these. I'd just like to say a grateful thanks to my husband here for helping me get the tripod set up so that everybody could see me, the fabric, and the sewing machine. So you do your forward and back here to lock your thread in place, and you are just sewing straight along the seam from the sleeve to the edge of the gusset. And this is where when I ironed it, this is where it comes in handy, because that ironing makes this seam much easier to sew over. You're going to sew until you sew over the thread marks from when you sewed the gusset on, which means that that's locked in place. Make sure that you have your needle down in your fabric and then lift the presser foot, as you can see I have just done, and then you can turn your fabric carefully. Don't tug hard on it. Make sure everything is sitting nice and neat, and then once it's ready to go again, you put the presser foot down and that will hold it in place, and then start moving forward again. And if you're wondering what I'm laughing at, it's because my grandson was baking cookies in the kitchen and doing silly things. So every once in a while I kind of grin. This would have been much easier if I had pinned it, but I've actually done this so many times at this point that I sometimes don't pin it. It's not the correct way to do it unless you get cocky, and trust me, when you get cocky you have a tendency to make mistakes, so don't do what I'm doing. You can see me do the gusset along here. I actually turn it again so that I can follow the edge. And again, I always make sure that the needle is down into the fabric before I lift the presser foot and before I move my fabric. That keeps it from moving around too much and making the threads get loose. You want the threads to stay exactly where they are. You're just turning it a little bit. It shouldn't hurt anything. Remember to put the foot down before you start sewing again, by the way. I've done that one before too. Lifting the foot up, reorienting yet again, and that will happen as you go through. It's fine to do that if you find you're having something bunch, if you have to move something, rearrange, just like I'm doing here, making sure everything is sitting flat, neat, even. It's not a race, and you can take as much time as you need to get this done. Now as I go, I try to keep the fabric pushed out behind and to the side so that it sits right as it's going up into the machine. But I'll repeat for the umpteenth time, if I had pinned this, it would have gone much quicker. The sewing part. But the pinning takes a while, and it can be frustrating too, because you don't want to sew with the pins in, so you take them out as you're going along, and that has its own level of frustration. And you can actually, if you forget to take a pin out and you sew over it, you can damage your sewing machine needle, and you can also damage the sewing machine itself. So don't sew over top of needles. That's never a good idea, or pins. And as I get down toward the bottom there, I'm going to do a back and forth just to keep it from fraying. But be aware that when you go to do the hemming, this will actually be cut off as you straighten the edges, and I'll show that in the final video. So do you remember? Oh, you ever wondered what that's for? If you have a sewing machine, it's a little cutter for your threads. If you've forgotten your scissors, you can still snip off your threads just by running them over that little razor blade there, and it lets you continue on with your work. As you can see, I'm having to piece it back together again. Had it been pinned, it would have already been in the right place, and I wouldn't have had to be putzing with it quite so much during the filming. But you can also see how much quicker I'm going. Now that the other side is together, it actually sits better on the table, and so goes much quicker, and I don't have to do quite as much fiddling. So if you remember rightly, I showed you the little bit at the beginning that's had the white strip that said Joanne Fabrics on it. So I didn't cut that off. You should cut that off when you go to do it. I know the idea of having a salvaged edge can be nice because it doesn't matter if you sew over top of it or flat fell it or any of the rest of that. But when you leave it on, if you're not careful when you're sewing, you can actually have it exposed on the outside of the tunic, which is what happened indeed when I turned this tunic outside out and looked at it. I was like, what the heck? So when I was sewing this, the sleeve ended up with that white strip showing on the good side of the fabric. Now I was able to, because I make these, their tunics generally are a little large, I was able to go back and basically sew down the white line so that it was hidden. It's not perfect, it's a little tight on the recipient, but it is functional. If I had paid attention and done it the right way the first time, that would not have been an issue. And in fact, on the tunic that I started after I finished this one, I made certain to snip all of those things off before I started cutting the fabric out, so that I would not forget. Now there are times when you can leave that, if you know for sure that that's going to be sewn in and nobody's going to see it, you can leave it on. Or if it's at the hem of something where you know you're going to be able to hem it up, that's fine. But generally speaking, you should always cut it off. You can see that I'm down near the bottom of the tunic at this point. I am at the unenviable stage of my life where my distance glasses are no good to me when I'm sewing, but my computer glasses and reading glasses are also no good to me when I'm sewing. Everything's at the wrong distance, so I go without and I squint a lot. And what I'm doing there is I'm actually pulling the fabric on the underside nice and taut so that it's flat, so that I don't end up, with folds or bunches underneath. You really don't want that. Although at some point you will get cocky, you will do it, and then you will end up swearing a lot and discovering how much of a great tool the stitch ripper is. I'll probably introduce you to that when I'm doing hems. I usually end up using it at least once while doing hems. And there we have the tunic done, machine off, glasses on so that I can see what the heck I'm doing. Now, flat felling is when you take the inside seams of something and you turn them over so that there's no raw edges showing. With flannel, it's not a huge big deal, but with wool and especially with linen it is. But there's the finished outfit, minus the hemming. This is an inner view of the underarm gusset, and you can see how neatly that came together, but you can also see how popped up that is. When I sew it, those will be sewed down flat like that, and it will be nice and neat. But you can see how neat the gore looks there. But of course, the inside is not where you judge the look of your gore. So this is again the same piece, the gusset on the outside, which looks pretty darn neat. And there's the gore. Nice, no bunching, came out nice and flat with a perfect top. How about that, folks? So that is the basic construction of a T-tunic. It's very plain. You can do different types of necklines. The one that we did for this video was a rolled neckline where you just turn it over twice and you sew it in place. But you can also do a yoke, which is sometimes you'll see it on the Viking where it's kind of like square, or it's like shaped like a hammer, or it has embroidery on it and it's different color. I will do a video on that at some point, but not right now because they're putsy to do and I didn't feel up to it. But now that I have the tripod working and everything with that is going well, I should be able to do a few more videos and I'll be able to do my cooking videos. So expect to see some food on here sometime soon. The things that are left to do on that tunic are to straighten out the bottom hem so that it sits flat, like even when it's on the person, and you can't do that until they're actually wearing it. So you require the participation of the person upon whom it will be displayed. You're going to mark it, fold it, and double fold it just like you did with the neckline, and then hem it in place. And then the same thing happens to the sleeves, and it's finished. I will show you in the last video the flat felling of the inner seams and the hemming of the sleeves and the bottom so that you can get an idea of how they look when they're finished and why you want to do the bottom hem in the way that I'm going to show you. But even as is, I know an awful lot of people who have showed up to events wearing unhemmed garments because that's what they had and they finished sewing it in the car. We've all done it. It's embarrassing and we've all done it. In fact, it's kind of a tradition for some people. So I hope you enjoyed the video and I will get back to you guys next week on the hemming and flat felling. So have yourselves a great weekend and I'll see you later. By the way, don't forget to subscribe and check me out on Facebook and my webpage.